Welcome to this walkthrough of TidyWork. Let's get started right away. When we go into the TidyWork screen here, we have a lot of different tabs, so I'll briefly introduce each one before going into depth. In the Home tab, we've got a Manager dashboard and a Resource dashboard. The Resource dashboard shows us how well resources are doing in the business. You can see a summary of time for the week or for the past month. There's also capacity information and so on. The Manager dashboard is more related to projects, how well projects are going, how profitable we are, and so on. The Quotes tab is where we can view quotes or create a new quote. Under the Projects tab, we can view a list of projects or create a new one. Here, we can pull up a calendar view and use our resource scheduler to assign people to projects, provided you have this feature. Under the Time, Materials and Expenses tab, you've got time entries, as well as material and expense entries. Then under the Approval tab, users with the approver permission can approve the time, material and expense entries submitted to projects. For sales and purchases, we've got invoice history and the invoice queue, which is a list of ready-to-go project invoices. Then we've got an order queue, which shows us how many items we need to purchase for use on jobs. This is our purchase order list, and here we create new purchase orders. Under the Inventory tab is a list of all of our materials in the system. For reporting, you can run different reports. You can run a data export, and there's also payroll. Under Global Settings, there are a lot of other settings such as company settings and the Xero setup. You can also set up your users, customers, and so on. Now that we've gone through all of the tabs, we'll go into each area in more depth. Let's head to the Quotes tab and create a new quote. This is what the new quote screen looks like. Click More Settings to expand this out first. Give the quote a code and a name. The code will be automatically generated if you don't enter your own. I'll name this quote Consulting for April. On the right side here, you can search by customer code or name, or you can do a search for a customer. We've got the customer contact and reference here, along with the quote expiry date. Optionally, you can add project start and end dates. Choose a project group here. Project groups separate out your projects by particular scopes of work, perhaps. You can also add special instructions. The salesperson is essentially the quote manager. If you have other users in your TidyWork system who have permissions to create quotes, down here under the Role Assignment tab, you can assign those users as a peer estimator, for instance. That means that they can also view and edit this quote, but the salesperson is the main manager of this quote. Now let's write down some tasks under the time plan. We'll add consulting, review drawings, presentation. When it comes to tasks, you can have subtasks, so they're in a hierarchy. In TidyWork, these are called parent and child tasks. In the effort column, you can add the number of hours expected to complete this task or subtask. Please note that once you add effort to a task, you won't be able to delete it or add subtasks to it. Remove the hours from the effort column first, then you'll be able to make edits again. You can also reorder the tasks by clicking Move Task Down. Over here we've got a junior staff rate, a senior staff rate and a supervisor rate. These are all set up in the Global Settings tab under Charge Rates. I'll navigate to this in a new tab to show you. Here we can see the 3 charge rates. Think of these as a foreman or an apprentice rate, a project manager rate, an administrator and other roles like that. So you can create those rates here for quoting purposes. Here you've got the currency, the amount, which is the charge rate, so how much you charge customers, and the quote cost is the internal cost. You can think of the difference between these two as a profit. You can edit these rates, and as you edit, TidyWork retains a full audit history of the charge rate. Now let's go back to our quote and assign time to these roles. I'll put 5 hours on the junior staff rate. Now on the left, you can see that the balance has gone down to 15 hours. This is the difference between what we scheduled on the left and the number of hours we originally assigned to this task. As you can see up here, we've got amounts for cost and revenue. The cost is based on the internal cost rate and the revenue is based on the charge rate. As I assign more charge rates to these tasks, we get more information, which gives us a price and budget for this quote. Moving on to the material plan now, this is where you can set up a list or bill of materials, if you like, that you plan to use for this particular quote. All of the materials in here can be found in your material inventory, so I'll just navigate here to show you in a new tab. This is where you set up your materials. Each material has to be part of a material category. Under the material items list, this is where you can set up each individual material item. You can also import these in bulk via a spreadsheet in the Import/Export section. Each item must have a unique code identifier and name. Codes can be up to 25 characters, and if you hover over the question mark icon, you can see what special characters you can use. Each item has a cost and a charge. You can give each item a suggested supplier, a usage unit, a reference, and a description as well. Going back to our quote again, you can do a search for material items and add them. Choose the quantities of each material you want to use, and as we do that, you can see it populate the material section above for revenue and cost. You can see the cost and charge of each item, but you can also add a markup to the materials if you like, to sort of override the charge. If there are some materials you don't want to charge out, you can untick that. So that's how you set up the materials you plan to use for the quote. Under the expense plan, you can think of these as sundry expenses that you're going to use for this project. This might be airline flights or coffees, things like that. You can classify them into billable and non-billable amounts. Under the Milestones tab, you can create new milestones for the project. These are really only used on fixed price projects. Under the Invoicing tab, we've got price types for quotes, whether it's time and material or fixed price. If I select fixed price, I can put in a fixed price for this job rather than it being based on time and materials. So then, if I go to milestones again, I can set up an invoice amount, so say 20% on acceptance of quote. Then I'll put in $600 over here. So once this milestone is achieved, it can be invoiced. If I save now, that has created our quote. Now, if you click Generate Quote, we offer these predefined templates for quotes, but you can also set up your own custom templates under the Templates section of Global Settings. Click New Template and select Project Quote, give it a name, and you can upload a template file with your custom branding and formatting. You can download a template for the project quote here and customize it with field codes to capture onto the quote. You can find these codes on our help documentation site, Tidy Academy. Back to the quote console. You can generate or email the quote and change its status to pending once it has been sent. If we navigate over to the quotes list, you can clone the quote. So what you can do with this is you might set up a template for a common job or service you provide, then you can clone over the tasks and materials to save you from having to set them up each time. If I click on Accept Quote, this converts the quote into a project. So we've got the code again. You can change the project manager if needed, the name and description, and the start date of the project. Then we can accept and it becomes a project. So now we're on the project screen. Under the time plan section, it's a similar screen to quotes, but it's also got departments. Under the global settings departments, this is where you can set these up. In TidyWork, there's a variety of ways to schedule or assign resources to a particular task. This is one of them. What you can do is put in 5 hours for this user. So similar to the quote before, you can see that the balance changes, and here we've got a charge and cost related to that user. On that note, let's take a look at users under global settings. This user section is where you can add users or edit permissions. I'll just go through these tabs now, moving away from the project for a minute. Here, you can give the user a login type, ID and password. Give them a first name, last name and display name. Also choose their department and enter their contact email. Roles are related to the user's permissions, which shows what they can and can't see within the software. In your TidyWork subscription, users will be billed as either team users or manager users. If any of these 3 permissions are ticked, they will be billed as a manager user. Project managers can see everything under the Projects tab. Resource administrators can see User under Global Settings, including current users' permissions, salary information, and they can add new users. System administrators can do everything else under Global Settings. So that includes customer settings, company settings, templates, charge rate information, Xero setup, and so on. If a user doesn't have any of the manager permissions ticked, they are a team member. Time, material and expense writers can enter time, materials and expenses for projects. Time, material and expense approvers can approve those entries. Invoices can generate project invoices, and estimators can create quotes. Purchasers can create purchase orders, and reporters can generate reports. Under options, we've got sub-permissions for the roles above. Then down here, if you want to get access to our API, you can click on this and you can get your own token here. So that's just the personal information tab for this user. Moving on through to the employment contract, here's where you can set up the user's timesheet details. If submission allowed is not ticked on a particular day, the user cannot submit time for that day. So here they won't be able to submit time in the weekend. Standard hours is set as 8 for the standard workday, and maximum hours allowed has been set to 24 per day. Down here, we've got internal cost rate or salary. When this user does time entries, the cost of that time entry to the job will be this internal cost rate, which you can also see in the project time plan. Once again, you will need to have the manager role of resource administrator to be able to see and edit all of this. Under invoicing information, you can set up the charge rate options for the user. Here we can see 3 roles we talked about earlier during quoting. But you can actually set up a user-specific charge rate that only be applied to this user. Then, under the Actions on Behalf tab, the way this works is you can impersonate other users by selecting the checkbox next to their name. Then click the button at the top by your username and select another user to impersonate. So basically, to perform actions for them. For example, filling out timesheets. This is also based on a permissions hierarchy, so you can't impersonate another user if they have more permissions than you. A team member, for example, won't be able to impersonate a project manager. If I go back to our project here, I can click on the default charge rate for this user and then pick and choose which charge rate I want to apply for each task. We've got the global charge rates as well as the user-specific charge rate that we set up earlier. As I schedule 5 hours for this user and 15 hours for this other user, it flows through to give us the charge information over here. You can click on this Quote Comparison button to compare what roles we originally quoted for and what roles were assigned. Another way you can schedule time is to put zeros in here because we don't actually know how many hours we're going to assign per person for each task. We can assign time by using the resource scheduler up here, which we'll go into in a few minutes. But if I leave these as zeros down here, it means that these users can still create time entries for this task. Under the material plan here, because we've set this as a fixed price job, none of the materials have a charge related to them, so this screen is similar to when we are doing the quoting. We've got our milestones here and then role assignment. We can tick these users to be peer managers in the system, and we can also tick them as approvers, meaning that they can approve time, material and expenses entries. Under the Invoicing tab, you can see the charge or rate of the project. Something else you can do is set projects as overheads or as non-billables. For example, if you have a workshop cleaning project, you can create an admin project just to track the time for that. But it's an overhead, so not billable. And now I can click Save. I said I would go through resource scheduling before, so let's do that now. Under the Projects tab, go to Schedule by Resource. This is a calendar view of all of our resources, and we can drag and drop tasks to those particular resources. You can also cycle back to previous days here to show what was previously scheduled. For the project we just created, let's drag and drop these tasks to a particular user. As we drag and drop, we can see that we've planned for 20 hours and we've scheduled for 8 hours for this user on this day. If the standard workday set up in the user settings is 8 hours, each resource assignment will default to 8 hours. You can also override this by clicking on it and editing the duration. You can drag this task along to other days too. And you can also drag up or down to other users by holding down the Control or Command key on your keyboard and dragging. Down here, we can see that we planned for 20 hours and we've scheduled 20 hours. So we have a 0 here and a tick, meaning that things balance. Now, we're not quite done with this process yet, because if you remember, we set the hours to 0 for this project, so there's no charge associated at the moment. If I now go and edit this task in the resource scheduler, I'll click on the arrows under the match column. The schedule hours will now flow back into the plan, and then go back to look at your project time plan. We can see that the hours have now been entered and the charge has been updated. So you can think of this resource scheduler as a place that you might come into once a week or once a day, where you can see all of the outstanding work that still needs to be scheduled. If you want an overview of the schedule summary, you can do so in here. You can click into each user to see information about the projects they're assigned to. Now I'll go in to create a time entry for one of these users. We can see the time that was booked for this user, so by clicking this arrow, we quickly create a time entry. For each time entry, you need to select a project, task, and activity. Activities are essentially what you did or undertook to complete a task. They can also be mapped to specific Xero accounts for your accounting if you have this setting switched on. This means that when you invoice out a project, it will collate all time entries for a particular activity and post it through to a particular revenue account. So back in our time entry, select an activity and you can also put in a note which is optional. You can add a start and end time, or you can just type the duration in. Then you hit enter and submit. As I have auto approval of time entries switched on in my user permissions, that entry has been automatically approved. If this permission wasn't on, the entry would appear as submitted. An approver would need to go into approvals. They click on a particular user and can choose to accept or reject their entries. Once time is approved, it commits the cost and charge onto our project. If it's a time and materials project, that entry is now billable. But if we go back to our fixed price project, here we can see that we've made a loss as we haven't invoiced anything yet. We've done a time entry now, and we've got this milestone. So, to see how invoicing works, let's set this milestone as achieved. Now we can see here that $600 is invoiceable. If we pop over to the Sales tab to see the invoice queue, we can see our projects and preview the invoice. We can then export it to Xero and click Generate. This is where the connection to Xero kicks in for invoicing. Map your TidyWork customer to a contact in your Xero account, then save. In your invoice history, you can download a PDF copy of the invoice or view and email it. Now that we've done all of our time and invoicing, let's take a look at material entries. We've got two options here, New Material and New Planned Material. Click on New Planned Material and select a project. As we planned these two materials in the initial quote for this project, they appear here. Select them to create an entry. You can also see the cost and charge associated. I can also tick items that require purchasing. You can also enter a new material that wasn't planned. So, similarly, choose your project, then search for the material used, add the quantity, the dimensions if relevant, click Purchase Order Required, and you can go through that process. On the right-hand side, you can see that, as I said, order is required for these materials. It shows we need to order these materials in. This can be done under our order queue. This shows a list of all outstanding materials that need to be ordered. We can see our project here and the materials we just requested. Select them and you can create a purchase order easily. This brings us through to our purchase order functionality. Here, you can put in a supplier and supplier reference. The quote number can perhaps go in here. You can have multiple delivery addresses set up for perhaps your warehouse. You can add an expected delivery date, the order date, the location, and here you can choose a purchase order template. Then down here is a list of all our items that we added from the order queue. You can add other items to the order by clicking New Line. You can save this purchase order as a draft, as approved, or as sent. Depending on a user's permissions, they might only be able to save purchase orders as a draft. Another user with approver permissions would then come in and change the status to approved. Once it's been approved, it can be downloaded and emailed to the supplier. Once the order is marked as sent, it can be received in. In TidyWork, you can actually export the invoice to Xero before receiving it in. If you click this Export to Xero button, you can change the invoice status, add an invoice number, date, and when it's due, then save. If I don't invoice to Xero first and just go to receive the order, it brings up this screen. You can set the invoice status and dates here. Optionally, you can put in some landing costs if they are supplier added landing costs. Here you can see all of the project related materials. You can create a purchase order for multiple projects. The materials don't all have to be for one project. This here just shows what we've received. You can edit these if what you received doesn't match what you ordered. You can also split off purchase orders into child purchase orders or sub-purchase orders and do a parcel receipt. If I proceed with this, what it does is receive those materials and export a supplier invoice through to Xero. Here we can see the material has been receipted in. The green delivery truck shows that it has been received. The Xero icon shows that it has been invoiced. If we go back to our project, we can see we have incurred some time and material costs. Let's take a look at the Xero setup now. For time and materials jobs, all time entries will be posted to the sales account. As I said before, you can also use activities to override this. This is also similar for materials, where you can use material categories to post to specific Xero accounts. For freight, we've also got an expense account. We've got a revenue account for expenses if we decide to charge out our expense entries. As our project is a fixed price project, it will be posted into this account here. All of the tax rates you have set up in TidyWork will show up under the tax rate section here. We can map these to different Xero accounts. An error will appear if you try to receive a purchase order in TidyWork without setting this up. Your Xero tracking categories can be used with project groups in TidyWork, so your project groups can be assigned to tracking categories. Branding shows your invoice templates, which you create in Xero. You can also specify which branding theme or invoice template to use for each project group. Now let's go back to our project to raise a final invoice. Let's mark it as complete. Once a project is marked as complete, it shows the cost, revenue, how much you've already invoiced from milestones, and how much is still invoiceable. So let's go back to the invoice queue, where we can export the invoice to Xero as a draft or approved, and then generate our final invoice. You can now set the project status as closed, and it will be removed from view in your project list. It'll still be in the system for analytics and reporting purposes, but it will be removed from view. Lastly, for this demo, I'll go over the report suite here. We've got project reports, time and productivity, operational reports, which show reports such as work in progress and so on. Under the data export, you can download CSV files containing all time and material entries and projects. So that's been a run through of TidyWork, going through all of the main functionality. We've created a quote, assigned roles, created a material plan, converted the quote into a project. We also did some resource scheduling, submitted time and material entries, created and received some purchase orders, and exported invoices to Xero. That's all. We hope you found this demo informative and that it provided a valuable overview of TidyWork for you. If you have any questions or would like to learn more, please feel free to reach out to our team via the chat function on our website or flicking us an email. Thanks again, and we do look forward to hearing from you soon.